Okay, we're live. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Seattle's Civil War Legacy once again. This month, in October, we have a couple special guests. This evening, we're going to get really local on our history, which we haven't been doing so much of lately. So tonight we have Judy Bentley and Dr. Lorraine McConaghy, and we're going to talk about their book, Free Boy. Was published in 2013. And it's a very captivating bit of local history involving slavery and an instance, I would say, the West Coast Underground Railroad. I think that might be the best way to put it. So let's let Dr. McConaghy and Judy introduce themselves to everybody that's watching. Perhaps, Lorraine, you'd like to start and tell us who you are and your background. And
my name is Lorraine McConaghy. I'm a public historian, which means a historian who has not taught very much, but has worked in museums and for the federal government and for other sort of entities outside of the academy. I took my PhD late in life. I was 40 when I finished, and it was a labor of love, and I have enjoyed my career very much. My primary interest at the Museum of History and Industry and Washington State History Museum and the other historical societies I have worked at has been in the antebellum period. And that's really where my interest began for the book we're talking about tonight.
Okay, and Judy?
Well, I have been a teacher. I taught at South Seattle College for many years, and I taught both English and Pacific Northwest history. So that has resulted in my writing a fair amount of regional history, although I started out writing young adult nonfiction before it was a very well-known field, and that's what brought me to collaborating with Lorraine on this book, Free Boy.
Well, with that, so how did you guys, where did this begin, this project? I think I've had a previous discussion with you, Lorraine, that it was almost accidental, the discovery of this story in the newspapers, if I remember that right, but how you came onto it. So why don't we start with sort of where the seed, the information of this story even began, and then maybe the two of you can tell us how you wound up teaming up together for the writing of the book.
Sure. Well, back in the 90s, I worked at the Seattle Times. Sherry Boswell and I were doing a 100th anniversary, big celebration of the Blethyn family ownership of that paper. We did a couple books. We wrote in the paper every Sunday. And in working in the collections at the Times, I fell in love with a drawing of Seattle in January of 1856, and there were actually two, but I only found one at the beginning, that was drawn from the deck of the U.S. sloop of war Decatur, looking east at Elliott Bay, with Yesler's Mill in the very, very center, Madame Damnable's brothel at the south end of town, and the little church and the incompleted blockhouse at the north end of town. I had not known that this kind of documentation existed for that antebellum period, and I have had that on my wall. You can't see it, but it's up on my wall. I've had it on my wall since 1992 or something like that. So I became interested in the 1850s, the antebellum period of Washington territorial history, and that brought me to an interest in political history. So Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan were the successive Democratic presidents who brought Washington Territory into the Union, and because we were a territory, appointed every significant office in the territory, from the governor to the postman. It was all political patronage. That meant that the territory, the political coloration of the territory was very strongly Democratic, because the way you got that patronage was to be a fawning political toady and have worked very hard for the election of Pierce and Buchanan. So the first newspaper in Washington Territory was called the Pioneer and Democrat because of this political coloration. Many of these appointees were pro-states' rights, pro-Southern, expansionist Democrats. And among them was James Tilton, who became a person of interest to Judy and me. So I have to say just a little bit more and then I'll shut up. When I was working at the Museum of History and Industry, my job was public historian there. That meant that when we got a big traveling show from the Smithsonian or from the Strong Museum in Rochester, my job was to root it in local experience so that it wasn't like an asteroid had landed in the galleries, but that it made sense in terms of local history. So in 2008, we had a show about the Civil War coming to the Museum of History and Industry, and my job was to come up with what was called the local component. Well, I had been to graduate school. I had gone through the whole academic mill, and every time we got to the Civil War in Washington Territory, whoever was teaching would say, well, everybody came west to grow orchards. Everybody came west to dig for coal. They didn't care about this.
Mm-hmm.
And that went against the grain. When I moved from Hackensack, New Jersey to Seattle in 1968, I brought myself with me, and so did the early settlers. So I went to research this local component with a little bit of apprehension and a little bit of optimism. So I thought, well, in 1860 is the great presidential election that brought Lincoln into the White House. It divided the Democratic Party in half. There's a strong fourth party, the Union Party. I bet you a good dinner there's going to be coverage of that, even though the territorial residents could not vote, regardless of gender or amount of money they had or anything like that. You couldn't vote as a territorial resident. So I went to the Pioneer and Democrat and I started reading in August of 1860, read. And I came upon a little headline that said fugitive slave case. And I thought, oh, fugitive slaves, I'm interested in that. I've done a lot of work in Cincinnati. Maybe this is about a fugitive slave case across the river. It wasn't. It was about Charles Mitchell. And it wasn't that this was totally unknown. I mean, it's mentioned in a couple secondary sources. It's in the newspaper. It's not exactly hidden. But I hadn't known it. And everyone I talked to hadn't known it. And as we began to flesh out our understanding of 1860 through the end of the Civil War, the territory really came alive. And the story of Charles Mitchell seemed key to that. And I had known Judy as a friend and a colleague for decades. And I knew of her strong work in young adult writing. And I wanted this to be a biography, not a novel. And I knew that she would be able to help me with that. So we began to talk.
So, Judy, looking at your resume of the writing, it's quite diverse, between tour, the hiking guides, those are, probably your most recent work, and the young adult stuff. But you also have a couple books that you've written on Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And was that an interest of yours prior to this connection with Lorraine? So you had a background on the topic, or was that something that came a result of this as well?
No, that did precede it. I was living on the East Coast in New York, writing young adult nonfiction, and one of the first, not the first book I wrote, but one of the first was a biography of Harriet Tubman. There had been no nonfiction biography of her since the 1930s, and P3 had done a very good fictionalized story of Tubman. So when my book came out in the 1990s, it was really the first nonfiction book in about biography in about 50 years. But as I was writing that, I met a colleague on the East Coast who told me about Thomas Garrett and William Still. And he said, Harriet Tubman is so well known, why don't you write something lesser known? And so I wrote about these two men who are fascinating to me. Thomas Garrett was a white Quaker in Wilmington, Delaware, which was nominally a slave state at the time. And William Still was a free black man in Philadelphia. And together, they wrote back and forth. Still was working for the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, and his job was to welcome fugitive slaves to Philadelphia, the first free city over the line. And he welcomed some 800 fugitives in the few years just before the Civil War, and later wrote about it. But much of his correspondence was with Thomas Garrett. Garrett was the Underground Railroad conductor. So these two men, white abolitionists, a free black man, worked together. And I thought that was really an unknown story. So I was very interested in, I found out a lot about the East Coast Underground and the Midwest Underground, but until Lorraine did her research, I had no idea there was anything similar on the West Coast.
So let's talk about that a little bit before we get too focused on James Tilton and Charles Mitchell themselves. But if there was a structure for this Underground Railroad of the West Coast, did that exist as early as the 1840s or 50s in that antebellum period, and the fact that, as we'll discuss with the story, we're going to talk about Victoria, British Columbia, and that being an established community for free blacks previous to that. So why don't one or both of you kind of set that stage up a little bit, like what existed in that sense before we even get into the discussion of Charles Mitchell when he arrives?
Well, Judy and I can bat that back and forth a little bit, but I think where we have to start is with Victoria and with mass exodus of African Americans from California that took place in 1857, 58, 59. And California was a free state. It banned slavery, but there were innumerable instances of systemic racism that barred African Americans in California from serving on juries, although that was illegal, that prevented the police from responding to their concerns about robbery, although that was illegal. The civil rights that we use that the term with such casualness were being completely disregarded in San Francisco. So well-to-do, prominent Black San Franciscans like Mifflin Gibbs. Mifflin Gibbs is a figure who matters to us. He became really the patriarch of the move from San Francisco to Victoria. And other destinations were considered. There's a lot to say about all this, but the most important thing is that Victoria ended up becoming the destination for about 500 African American men, women, and children. And it included an individual we know as Archie Lee. And like so many names that we have, although he is a person, he is representative of a larger group about whom we know very little. Archie Lee was an African American who had been brought by his former master from a slaveholding state into California, where slavery was illegal. Nevertheless, his master farmed him out to others, and so that the former slave worked at his trades for others, and the former master kept his wages. So it is a form of slavery, of course, of economic slavery. Archie Lee, there's a fair bibliography about him. Anyone can learn more about him. But he went to Victoria with Mifflin Gibbs. Gibbs wrote an autobiography called Shadows and Light. And it has a great deal more in it about what Judy's been discussing in terms of the Underground Railroad back east. But although we cannot prove it, it is clear that Gibbs had experience with an underground railroad, if you will, and that inspired the community in Victoria. Now, just one or two more things. Victoria was almost 20% Black in 1860 because of this enormous exodus from California, and then the kind of each one reach one, where a letter would be sent to say, Victoria, there's wonderful quotes by the Black founders, the Black settlers in Victoria, that this was a heaven-sent place for the colored people, as they call themselves. That all a man needed was a little bit of capital and a lot of good ideas, and he could become wealthy. This community created itself as a base for reaching out to Charles Mitchell. And in 2019, after this book was published, the last work I've really presented about it, I had done quite a bit more work on the African Canadian members of this Underground Railroad. We know their names. I presented to the National Park Service, and there was tremendous interest because it is very seldom that an Underground Railroad is entirely staffed by people of color with virtually no white intervention. We do have attorneys, white attorneys in Victoria, who took a strong hand in helping Charles Mitchell. But everyone along the way was a person of color. And that was an extraordinary thing.
Yeah. So you said like 500 was in 1860. So were those were the majority of those having had escaped from enslavement, or were there free blacks who had gone there? Because you said it was this community that was sought out. So would they come to California and then say that's a better choice than being in California and just on their own decision to go up there?
Richard, as far as I know, and maybe Judy knows better than I, but I believe as far as we know, we don't know the birth status of all of the Black Canadians who were there because they didn't stay. After 1865, after the Civil War was over, most all of them returned to the United States. So this big 20% in 1860 will fall dramatically by the end of that time. And then just one more thing, the Dred Scott decision becomes very important in Washington Territory. So the Dred Scott decision is a decision of the United States Supreme Court in which Dred Scott sued for his freedom, having been taken by his master, who was a military doctor, into free territory, and then brought back after quite a long period of time to enslaved territory. So Dred Scott sued with white attorneys advocating for him, and the Supreme Court judged against him. First of all, they said, no, you are not free. Ownership of property is one of the fundamental rights of the Constitution of the United States. You are property, Dred Scott. Second, you're not a person. You're not a citizen. You have no legal standing before this court. And, it's an appalling decision. It's important to us here in Washington because it legalized slavery in Washington Territory. If it is the case, as the court had decided, that every man's property is his property, then people who immigrated here, they brought their Bible, they brought their garden seeds, they brought their ideas, and some of them, I believe, brought enslaved people. Finding them is very difficult.
So if we're considering California, because of course that's, the Western settlement predates here in Washington, and what were the numbers? Do we have anything? Because I know you don't have much as far as picking out some of those particular names here in Washington Territory, but is there better luck in Oregon Territory and California of identifying some of these people that way, to know that they had actually been brought to California in an enslaved state, and then is that easier to trace other places beyond Washington?
There's scholarship on that. I'm not sure I can come up with the name. Judy, can you remember the name of that guy in Oregon who's written so much about slavery there?
Noakes, maybe?
Yes, Noakes.
Noakes, N-O-K-E-S. That sounds familiar. Yeah. Yes. I haven't read anything, but the name sounds familiar. For sure.
He's on my shelf here. But there's a lot about Archie Lee, for instance. There's quite a bit about people of color in California, and the Knights of the Golden Circle in California, who will probably come up later in this conversation. Yeah.
So, Judy, would you like to add anything about the Victoria community or aspects of that before we introduce Mr. Tilton and Mr. Mitchell?
No, I think Lorraine covered it well, and I'll talk about Tilton and a little bit about Mitchell.
So for anybody who hasn't read the book, those are the two primary characters that we're going to be dealing with the story that Judy and Lorraine have told in this book. So I think maybe what we should do is who is James Tilton and why was he here? And I don't mean that why did they come west, because that's the unanswerable cyclical question we get about anybody that wound up in Washington Territory. But I think we know pretty specifically with him, employment-wise, or a position he was appointed to, that made him leave where he was in the South and come here to Washington. So maybe you can tell us about that, and then who was Charles Mitchell that he had with him.
Sure. James Tilton came from a very prominent family in Delaware. His great uncle was also named Dr. James Tilton. One of the things we ran into a whole slew of James Tiltons. It became quite confusing after a while.
I know the phenomenon.
But the great uncle was George Washington's doctor during the Revolutionary War. He went on to become Surgeon General of the United States, the first one. So the family was well established in Wilmington, Delaware, and this is the father's side. They had come from southern Delaware. The family, a couple generations back, probably owned a few slaves, but by the time our James Tilton was born, they moved into the professions. His father was a doctor. He had an uncle who was a surveyor, which was a very popular profession at the time, as the U.S. was taking so much land as it spread west. His mother's side came from Maryland, and she came from a family that had the Gibsons had owned slaves since the late 1600s. They were very prosperous for many years, and then Maryland's economy suffered with more tobacco grew better in Virginia, and their plantation began to dwindle until it really came on hard times, and they had just a few enslaved people left.
And this is Eastern Maryland, right?
Yes, this is the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Talbot County, right below Dorchester County, which is where Harriet Tubman came from. Frederick Douglass was from Talbot County. So, and of course, Eastern Shore is closer to Delaware. You can get north a little bit more easily. So we get a lot of the people we know today as having been leaders of kind of the early abolitionist movements coming from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, for sure. So this is Tilton's mother, and his father had actually married two of the Gibson sisters while the first one died. His father begins to have some responsibility for real estate there, and also for the enslaved people who are part of that. So go back a little bit and get James Tilton to be an adult for a while. His father, Dr. James Tilton, moved the family from Wilmington, Delaware, where he had worked as a doctor for the DuPont gunpowder factory. And they moved to Indiana, which was a new state. They moved there in the 1820s. It's a frontier state, a lot of opportunity. Doctor set up a medical practice. He bought land near a railroad that was being built to the middle of the state, eventually Indianapolis, founded the town of DuPont. So again, the Tiltons flourished in a frontier society. Young James became a surveyor at the age of 14. He was trained.
Wow.
And surveying lands farther west. And then he joined the Mexican-American War, which any young man with ambition and so-called patriotism at the time participated in. And that's where he made contact with Franklin Pierce and many other people who would be important to his career. Indiana at the time was right on the border of Madison, Indiana, which is where they were. It's on the Ohio River. Across the river is Kentucky. You have a real clash of both people of abolitionists moving in from the east and former slave owners moving from Kentucky, and you have a real maelstrom of racial conflict and disagreements prior to the Civil War in Indiana. So that's the milieu that Tilton grew up in. And I don't know, you want to talk about Charles, Lorraine? Or you want me to keep going with Charles too?
Well, let's just bat it back and forth. I mean, Charles' birth and the death of his mother remind us of how fragile life was in this era of epidemics. So he was only 3 in 1848-9 when his mother died in the Great Cholera epidemic, which, throughout the United States took an incredible toll. And when we think about the antebellum period and think about the Civil War, we have to think about life as more fragile and more threatened than we really think about it today. But anyway, on her deathbed, Charles Mitchell's mother asked her mistress to take good care of my Charlie. Now, Charles Mitchell was the son of a white oyster fisherman on Chesapeake Bay and a black house slave, a woman, the woman whom I've mentioned just died. We know very little, virtually nothing, about the circumstances of their relationship, whether it was romantic, whether it was rape. But we do not see that white oyster fisherman taking a role in Charles Mitchell's life. I think it's an important point that slavery inheres in the female line. So even though Charles Mitchell's father was, a white American citizen, there was no question but that he was a slave on the plantation. So as time goes on, and a lot of our resources for this part of our biography come from within the family itself, although not all of the sources do. But James Tilton perhaps was given Charles Mitchell as a wedding gift. Perhaps not. You have family stories in all of your families that are repeated every Thanksgiving, and every Thanksgiving they're different. So some of the stories we have from within the family may not be completely dependable. But Charles Mitchell ended up going with James Tilton and his family to his new political appointment in Washington Territory.
He was thought to be going to a free territory at the time. I mean, that was the phrase used. But as Lorraine explained, after the Dred Scott decision, there was no such thing as a free territory.
Was Mitchell with him in Indiana at all, or was he was still in Maryland until Tilton came here to Washington?
We don't think so. We don't know exactly. The assumption is that Tilton went back to Maryland before he came west, and
that makes sense.
But we don't know that for sure.
Okay.
It was his cousin who gave Charles to Tilton. She was one of just a few women left running the plantation, and they were pretty much winding it down and moving to town. And there, at the time, according to family history, there was a promise that Tilton would train Mitchell as a ship steward and would free him when he turned 18. So that's the family lore for the family.
So what was his appointment here in the Washington Territory officially that he came out for? It was surveying, but what was his title and what was his job?
He was the surveyor general here.
Okay.
So he was in a position to hire other like-minded family members, Democrat friends. I mean, it's a kind of a cronyism. And he was also a very fine surveyor. As Judy's pointed out, he qualified very, very young. I don't want to omit, though, as we speak, I've got this note with stars around it here, the sources that we use to do this book. The University of Washington Press preferred that we not use endnotes or footnotes. So we tried as hard as we could to include in the text of the biography how we know what we're saying, that this is not a novel. But for people who are interested, blackpast.com, so blackpast.com, just go to that website. Pardon me?
Is it
.org? I think it's .org. Yeah, .org.
I'm so sorry. Thank you very much. So blackpast.org and type in Freeboy, and it will take you to a unit that Judy and I put together of many, many, many of our primary sources that we scanned and uploaded so that anyone can see what we based this twin biography on. Because the argument that we've made here is that this is a biography of an enslaved child and a master. and that they mutually affect one another. We can see in James Tilton's life his resentment at Charles Mitchell's decisions and the radicalization of his racial position because of Charles Mitchell's behavior. I think that's important and interesting.
Well, speaking of his decision and behavior, so let's set the stage that they're here in Olympia, right? They were, he was Surveyor General based in Olympia. And then how does this start to play out? What is, I know the book, the way it's constructed is like you said, it's not a novel, but the internal conversations or even actual conversations are sort of suggested and fictionalized a bit, or entirely, because we don't know specifically what he said. But as you read that, you start to see how he comes to this decision and what surrounds him that enables him to see this as a possibility. And so perhaps you can tell us about that. Like they're in Olympia, and Charles Mitchell is getting some ideas in his head. How is that even occurring? Like where is he getting influence other than or seeing different possibilities or that sort of thing?
Well, we can see him in the 1860 census. And in a way, it's kind of a snapshot of the Tilton family with this black child. And of course, he's not listed as slave. That's why this research is difficult. If one were simply reading the census, which is a lot of fun to do, if you can't sleep, just boot up the census from 1860. He's there, he's black, he's a child. That's all there is to know.
And his age.
Pardon me?
And generally his age.
Yeah, what is his age? What is his age in 1860 again?
13.
He's 13. Okay, I thought so. It's over 13. Okay.
And we know, from later primary source material, how he was approached by these representatives of the African Canadian Underground Railroad of Puget Sound. One of them was a cook on board the Eliza Anderson, which was the major mail steamer, international, as they put it, that went back and forth between Olympia and Victoria, stopping along the way at Steilacoom, at Seattle. You wave a flag and it stops. So that cook is an essential part of this. Judy, you pick it up there.
Well, and Mitchell was quite visible in Olympia because there were very few other African Americans. The Howards ran a restaurant, and the Bush family, which is a biracial family, we don't know for sure at all that Mitchell knew them, but they were just south of Olympia and quite prominent. So he's a visible boy. He's probably running errands, and he. I don't know that he had so many ideas. Fifth Avenue Theater did a wonderful dramatization of this book for schools, and I thought one of the things they did so well was portray the difficult decision that Mitchell had to make between responding to these black men who were encouraging him to be free and staying within what was probably a relatively comfortable situation in Olympia, because the Tiltons were, did fine in terms of being a family. So he's a young boy, really, making a very difficult decision. But in the end, he was persuaded. He sneaked down to the Eliza Anderson, got in, was hidden. Well, there's more to the story there that picks up in Victoria.
Sure.
I think that's what you were asking more about, what it was like in Olympia.
Yeah. So he gets on board with assistance on the Eliza Anderson, and then I'm assuming it's a day to get to Victoria with all the stops for them.
Well, he's hidden down in the galley. The cook is this very instrumental figure in bringing Charles Mitchell on board at dawn at Olympia. This child, who, as Judy has said, made this incredible choice. You couldn't look up Victoria on the internet. He had to trust his life to these black men that he had met and barely knew. It's interesting that the Eliza Anderson stopped in Seattle on the way up to Victoria, and Charles Mitchell was discovered on board by a small group of soldiers from Fort Steilacoom who were hunting for deserters from the U.S. Army that might have snuck on board the Eliza Anderson. Isn't that remarkable? And as they're rooting around in the galley, they find this young black child. And we don't know as much as I wish we did about the captain, Fleming. We find him in correspondence. He makes his position clear that James Tilton owns Charles Mitchell. I think, there's a tendency in the Pacific Northwest to think, oh, well, slavery, yeah, that's Alabama. But the captain of the Eliza Anderson regarded Charles Mitchell as the property of James Tilton and swore that he would return him and put him to work on the way to Victoria, shoveling coal into the engine. So the passage is important as well as the departure and the destination, I think.
And there was he, I seem to remember something about him being put in a closet. Was that when he arrived in Victoria, or was that on the way, or am I misremembering?
He's put in the lamp room on board the Eliza Anderson. And after a lot of digging around, the lamp room means different things on different ships. It's not a closet exactly, but, he was not free. He was not free.
Okay. So am I skipping anything too much to ask when the Eliza Anderson arrives in Victoria? I don't want to skip over anything important, but just to make sure we get to that the arrival in Victoria is to me, that was my favorite part of the book, is the story of what happens when the ship arrives, and how he's handled at that point, and then of course the ultimate outcome. So the Eliza Anderson steams up to Victoria. It shows up. Do they know any of this in advance? Because the news, everything is on the Eliza Anderson, so there's no word getting ahead of it, I assume, at this point. So I think there's drama on the ship, and are the people in Victoria aware because it was coordinated with this cook on the ship that he would be coming, or does this just shows up and there's a lot of drama when the Eliza Anderson shows up that day?
Well, the drama comes because he is expected. There is a crowd waiting for him. There's another man on the boat, William Jerome, who was also in on this, and so they were expecting him to come off the ship, and he didn't. And so they went before a judge. The sheriff was not going to go on board and take him off. Captain Fleming was quite indignant about the fact that he was not going to let him off the ship, but they had to get a writ of habeas corpus from a judge, which is a writ to bring the body in front of me. And Mitchell spent a night in the jail before the hearing the next day, but supported, we believe, by the crowd outside who knew he was there. And I'll give you, Lorraine, you want to take over the hearing?
Oh, I was.
I think I'm going.
One of the things that's interesting about the Black community in Victoria was that they were so adamantly opposed to segregation that they did not start Black clubs and Black churches by and large. So it was hard for us to find the kind of first person primary source documentation that we wanted to find. So we know from newspaper articles, and you can go to blackpast.org and see those, that Charles Mitchell went into the Black community after he was freed before the judge. There's no slavery in Canada. There's no slavery in the British Empire at that point, sort of, pretty much. So Charles Mitchell is freed into the Black community. We do not know with what family he lived. After assiduous research, and after the book was published, a lot of people got in touch with Judy and with me, and we still don't really know that. We know what school he went through, the collegiate boys' school. We know that it had tuition, which had to be paid. We haven't mentioned that the way the book is organized, there are italicized sections which depart from a fact-based narrative. They explore motivation. They, as you've said, Richard, include dialogue. They describe situations based on our best understanding of the evidence, but we cannot, if it's in italics, we're not sure if it's true. And this is where in Victoria here, I just wish we had been able to learn more. What we could learn, put Charles in school. We have the firsthand observation of a visitor to that school who saw him in class, who regarded him as not terrifically intelligent. It was an integrated class racially. It was an exceptional prep school, and that we do know. So he was very competitive intellectually.
So was there some conflict from Tilton on this? I mean, they must have said, hey, that's mine. Like, what are you doing? I know he's in Canada, but I'm sure they fought. Maybe you want to touch on that a little bit too, just a bit, and then we'll get into a little bit later with Charles.
Yes, at first Tilton was quite enraged and threatened really to make kind of an international incident over it, that the British had no right to take Mitchell off the boat. There was a letter to the Secretary of State, I believe, Lorraine, trying to enlist his aid. But Tilton did give it up fairly soon. He kind of washed his hands of it and said, well, he didn't think much of Charles Mitchell anyhow. So he wasn't going to put his effort into it. But it threatened for a while. It's kind of a precursor of the Pig War in a way, and we get into a British and American spat over international rights.
Well, speaking of the Pig War, just for our Civil War fans that are watching tonight, there's a connection between Mr. Tilton and the famous General George Pickett. Am I correct about that?
Yes.
Maybe we could just for novelty's sake touch on that relationship a little bit too, because I think that's a fascinating part of the story too. Is the web, the web of these people really it crosses a lot of relationships and boundaries and lines that you wouldn't expect that this story would have that kind of reach.
George Pickett was stationed in Bellingham with the Army, and he had a Native American wife, and they had a son, and she died shortly thereafter. But he named that son James Tilton Pickett, and you wonder why. I think partly our speculation is, Tilton was a well enough to do person. He had stature. Naming him after Tilton may not have been such because they were such buddies, but because Tilton would be in a position to protect the boy. And then when Pickett left to go fight in the Civil War, he left James Tilton Pickett in the care of a couple of the Collinses, but Tilton became his financial conduit. So any support for the boy came through Tilton. So they had that kind of fiduciary relationship.
Yeah, I thought that was a neat little aside to the whole thing. If you can bring George Pickett into a story, you have to take advantage of that opportunity.
Well, I think more could be said too about Secession Winter that links the territory with the greater United States and the Confederate States of America. So Charles Mitchell left at the end of September of 1860. The presidential election is in November of 1860. The states that would form the Confederacy, most of them, had said that if you elect Abraham Lincoln as president, we are gone, and that is what they acted on. So what has just become of consuming interest to me is what happened in Washington Territory as people went back east to fight both for the Confederate States of America, and Pickett is a very good example of that, someone who resigned his commission in the United States Army. I've done a lot of work on the U.S. sloop of war Decatur in the U.S. Navy, and the officers of that ship went 40-60 to the Confederate Navy and the U.S. Navy. The division in the Pacific is it's fundamental. And what did I want to say? Oh, so there are people like Patton Anderson, like George Pickett, who leave to go to the Confederate States of America. There's a fellow who walked all the way from Washington Territory to Indiana to enlist in the United States Army. That's commitment, that is. But there are some who stayed, and James Tilton stayed. He did not go south. And as the territory responds to the Civil War, the ideas that drove the Civil War back east drive controversy here. And the Knights of the Golden Circle, which are so significant in Indiana in particular, where this committed group of pro-Southern men who drill in secret, who are duty bound to shoot the Lincoln appointees, right? So all of the Democrats that Pierce and Buchanan appointed, like Tilton, are out of a job. So the governor of Washington Territory, Richard Dickerson Golson, is out of a job. He goes south. Now we have a new governor that Abraham Lincoln appoints. The Knights of the Golden Circle here in Washington Territory drilled to assassinate those Lincoln appointees and replace them with Confederate appointees. It didn't happen, but it was very conspicuous, and Tilton was always rumored to be a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle. We cannot prove it. The best collection in the Northwest about the Knights is at the Oregon Historical Society. And because it's a secret society, it's like trying to research the Ku Klux Klan. It's very hard to figure out who was in and who was out. But Tilton, throughout the war years, is very conspicuous in territorial politics and newspapers.
And so, do we, I guess we'll kind of wind down here a little bit, that we have Charles Mitchell in Victoria in 1860, the fall of 1860. Things play out the way that they do. The book kind of leaves us off with a little bit of a feeling of that we kind of lose track of him, and he kind of walks off into the woods, and that's the last we hear of him. But I don't know that since then more has come. You had mentioned that so many people contacted you after the book. Do we know more about what his story ended up being since the book was written in 2013?
We know a lot more. A legal researcher named Thomas Blake really took this on as a project. Mitchell was such a common name, Charles Mitchell, that it was hard to pin down. But Blake did a lot of research in census, city directories, and eventually military pensions. And we had just a few key pieces of information, which is Mitchell's name, and the fact that it's not just Charles Mitchell, but that he comes from a family, the slave-owning family, the Gibsons. So Charles Gibson Mitchell becomes an important part of this. Know his age and his birthplace. And Blake found that, I think very, very likely that the Charles Mitchell we wrote about returned to the United States just a few months before the end of the Civil War, enlisted, maybe misrepresented his age, he's a little young still, and he enlisted in a San Francisco infantry company just a few months before the end of the war. So he ends up with a military pension, record, which tells us a lot. He became a mariner, he became a ship steward, as Tilton had somewhat perhaps prepared him for. He traveled the world. He married twice. His first wife died. His second wife he met in Liverpool, England, and brought her back with his mother-in-law. He had injuries. It was a kind of a hard physical labor kind of life. So he got an invalid pension eventually. He had at least 4 children who grew to adulthood, but only one of those had a child, and that seems to be the end of the line. So we have not found any living direct descendants of Mitchell, but maybe somebody else will take this up. because it's.
And then, of course, we don't know where he's buried or anything like that.
Oh, we do.
Oh, you do. So where did he wind up?
He died in a kind of a soldiers and sailors home in California. I don't have that right in front of me, but we know when he died and where he died.
Oh, okay.
So, and we know his widow, where she got a pension, and the names of his children. So there's quite a record there eventually for a boy who had no written statements left behind. We have his signature, and descriptions of him physically. And that's
from the soldiers' home records too. I'm sure they have his application and everything. Yeah.
So we would very much love to do a new edition of our.
Well, that was my very next question. Are you going to do a on the 10th anniversary, perhaps in a couple of years?
Revised edition. Yeah.
It would be great.
So what do you? Not only a new addition to that, but do you guys have anything else, writing-wise or research-wise, that you're working that has come out of this? I know, Lorraine, you obviously the topic of the antebellum politics and all that. I mean, that's a whole universe in and of itself, which I would maybe separate that a little bit specifically from the Charles Mitchell story. But are there other things like this that have come up that you thought this needs to be treated fully as a book or a body of work or anything like that is in progress, or maybe in your mind a little bit to work on?
It's been very hard to do real research for the last 2 years.
Well, yeah.
The only work you can do is online work. And that only takes you up to a certain point. I remain extremely interested in slavery in Washington Territory. And the second slave that I only found because she was mentioned in a piece of correspondence. She doesn't even appear in the census. She wasn't here in 1860 and she was gone by 1870. She's only known as Mammy, and she was at Fort Steilacoom. I think that this is an obligation on my heart, is to bring back this antebellum, wartime, and Reconstruction history that is so easily gone over as it's just Washington Territory. We don't become a state until 1889. There's nothing to talk about. That's not true. There's lots to talk about.
Sure.
And when I was coming in my late 70s now, when I was coming up, many museums were shrines to the founders. They were shrines to settlers. And whatever reprobates these settlers may have been, their children were the first children born west of the Cascades. A lot has changed, but it's fundamental research that makes that change. You can't just bring an attitude to history. You have to bring research to history.
Sure.
So I continue to be very interested in slavery. And when I can get back to University of Washington Special Collections and Washington State Archives and all of that, I'll continue to work on that period, 1856 to 1880.
Yeah. I found in my work with the post-war veterans, of course, I've spent a lot of time in the censuses and the directories, territorial census, federal census, and so on, and I have the massive notebooks full of the veterans and where they're at and all the basic information. And I have several pages that are dedicated just to people that I've come across between 1890 and the 1910 census that were of age and were born in Mississippi or Alabama or Tennessee. A lot of them were here at Franklin or Newcastle. But there's a lot that lived right here in Seattle. And they're very elusive figures to me because their name shows up and then you don't see it again. But there's hundreds of them that were formerly enslaved people that were, had gone as part of the great, I forget the right exact term, but he moved to Kansas and Nebraska and then on, here. And I was curious if you had any interest in that far removed from the war, like those people, because there's several Victorian era Seattleites that are well known, some former Civil War soldiers among others, but there's another like 200 or so that were here in 1900 that are just names on a list to me, and I think those are incredibly significant people to our history, and And to me, I've not found much of anything research-wise or published or even spoken about with those former enslaved that wound up here. Do you have
Well, I mean, I'm
any insight
interested in your work, but that's far afield for me. When I worked at a museum, you have to be a master of everything. You have to be able to write about World War II and Microsoft and all of that. Now that I'm retired, I get to focus on what I really love and what I'm really interested in. Yeah, there's, I don't know, Judy, are you continuing to work in this period?
Not in this period. I think one thing that came out of this for me was I grew up in Indiana. So to read about Tilton's family history and the pre-Civil War history in Indiana was fascinating to me. And I did spend a year putting together some letters parents wrote to each other during World War II that Indiana Historical Society published. And I'm very interested now in looking at the way I grew up in Indiana in an integrated school and integrated city, but in such a different life experience. And I'm looking back at even Washington, Indiana, where my father was in the basketball team. I never knew there were African Americans living in Washington, Indiana. Didn't know anyone from that period. So the racial history of Indiana is what interests me somewhat.
Interesting.
But I live far away from there now, so I'm not sure I can do too much there.
Well, Judy, you can on that. Go ahead.
I think the three of us. I mean, I'm going to suggest this here. I don't know how many people are involved in this conversation, but in 2014, the Washington State Historical Society mounted an exhibit about the Civil War in Washington Territory, and I had the chance to curate that. And we based that exhibit on a statewide read-in of primary sources. There were almost 150 people reading correspondence, newspapers, every kind of primary source you could think of, and putting their, anytime they found anything that was pertinent to the stories we were telling, it went into a database. And out of that came not only wonderful hints, people in Walla Walla saying, you know, Washington Territory is a perfect open door to Canada for an underground railroad. I mean, just being able to find a statement like that, where they're talking about east of the Cascades, you know, not what Judy and I worked on, but completely different routes. We know very little about that. I would love to see a statewide read-in to learn about your veteran, Richard, and to learn everything we can. In my lifetime, there's not going to be enough time to read everything I need to read to answer the questions that I have.
Yeah, I've come across some pretty interesting things. Occurrences of violence in Eastern Washington during the war. There was I believe somebody was stabbed or something because they got in a fight over states' rights in Walla Walla at a barbershop, something like that. A number of things like that, and then different accounts of things in early Seattle, hanging burning effigies of Jefferson Davis in 1861 here in Seattle, and writings from the Denny and Yesler accounts and things like that.
Right.
That I would love to be able, because I focus so much on 1861 to 1865 in the East, and then some of our Western states troops were fighting Native Americans in Utah and whatever. But I don't have much of a bridge between what your focus is and what my focus is, and like that creating a cache of all that information, like you said, of different articles of that period of the 60s and 70s here in Washington, to then put that together is immensely appealing to me. That's a great idea. So I think I'd like to give you guys both a chance to tell everybody where to find your work. The book, Free Boy, which is the background here, is certainly available at every library around here in Washington anyway. Amazon, of course, has many copies. Things you guys have, Judy, I know you have your website for your work. Do you have anything for yours, Lorraine?
Lorraine?
Yeah.
No.
Okay,
No,
so
but
just
it's not hard to find the book.
yeah.
University of Washington Press.
Yeah.
You go directly to the press for the book
Okay.
too.
And then Judy, your website, if you want to tell everybody about that with your other books, your hiking history in Washington books, and that would be good to.
Sure, it's just www.judybentley.com. And my most recent books are Hiking Washington's History. The first edition came out in 2010, and then the second edition came out this spring. Co-authored with Craig Romano. We have 44 historic hikes in Washington State. Fascinating state. There were the trails all over the state. I mean, these are some trails that are 7,000 years old, which is amazing to me that they still exist. And then I had a more urban book, Walking Washington's History. If you're not a hiker, you can walk in the city. And that tells those are historic walks in 10 Washington cities. So those are my other two books. You can find out. They're all University of Washington Press, so that's
good.
an easy place to go for them.
Yeah.
They're online in bookstores too.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm scanning the questions here. We have a couple of people that just said good evening, and they're watching we have people from Colorado and Pennsylvania, among other places. Somebody just got the book from the library, but no questions, unfortunately. I thought there might be some questions, but nobody offered up any questions. So I guess with that, I just want to thank you guys for coming on tonight, and it was a really great discussion. And it's nice for me to turn back the clock before 1860 sometimes. So I learned a lot tonight. I enjoyed the book immensely myself. I think anybody that follows this channel would certainly enjoy reading it. So if you are watching tonight, make a point to go out and purchase that and support their work. And I guess that'll wrap it up. If you guys have anything else you want to say or questions or anything.
Just thank you.
No? All right.
Thank you very much.
Okay, guys.
Lorraine,
Well,
too.
all right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. And
it's fun to do books together. I will add that. There's a real value to writing co-authoring books.
Yeah. Well, it makes for a fun conversation after too.
Right.
You have both of you guys to give us different perspectives. It was a fun conversation, and thank you guys, and thanks everybody for watching from, looks like we have Santa Cruz, California too. So we got everybody from everywhere tonight. So, all right, thanks for watching. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.